There are mysteries in this world that keep even the most seasoned investigators awake at night. Cases so bizarre, so utterly confounding, that they've stumped forensic experts, puzzled scientists, and left law enforcement agencies scratching their heads for decades. These aren't your typical cold cases that eventually get solved with new technology or a lucky break. No, these are the ones that seem to defy logic itself, the ones that make you question everything you thought you knew about how the world works. Today we're diving deep into 10 of the creepiest unsolved cases that have baffled experts around the globe. From vanishings that shouldn't be possible to discoveries that challenge our understanding of reality, these mysteries will leave you questioning what's really out there in the shadows. So fasten your seatbelt as we dive into today's mystery. But first, you'll have incredible luck if you like and subscribe before this video ends. What makes these cases so unsettling isn't just that they remain unsolved, it's that every attempt to explain them only raises more questions, every piece of evidence leads down another rabbit hole, every witness account adds another layer of impossibility. These are the cases that forensic scientists whisper about in conference hallways, the ones that make veteran detectives reconsider everything they've learned about human behavior and the natural world. I've spent countless hours researching these mysteries for Dream Vault Mysteries, poring over police reports, interviewing experts, and trying to piece together the fragments of truth hidden within each case. What I discovered is that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They exist in that terrifying space between the known and unknown, where logic breaks down and anything becomes possible. But here's what's truly chilling. Each of these cases isn't just a standalone mystery. They're connected by invisible threads that suggest something far more disturbing might be at play. Patterns that emerge only when you step back and look at the bigger picture. Connections that make you wonder if we're dealing with isolated incidents or glimpses into something much darker. The first case takes us to a small town where an entire family vanished without leaving behind a single clue. Not just disappeared, but erased so completely that it's as if they never existed at all. Case number 1. The vanishing of the Hendricks family. In the summer of 2003, the Hendricks family was living what seemed to be a perfectly ordinary life in the quiet town of Cedar Falls, Montana. Robert Hendricks worked as an accountant at the local bank, his wife Margaret taught 4th grade at the elementary school, and their 2 children, 12-year-old Emma and 8-year-old Tyler, were typical kids who loved riding their bikes and playing in the woods behind their house. On the morning of July 15th, everything changed, or rather, everything stopped. Margaret's sister Lisa arrived at the Hendricks house around 10 in the morning for their weekly coffee date. She found the front door unlocked, which wasn't unusual for the family, but when she called out and received no response, she became concerned. Walking through the house, she discovered something that would haunt investigators for years to come. The house was perfectly intact. Breakfast dishes sat on the kitchen table, still containing half-eaten cereal that hadn't yet gotten soggy. Coffee was still warm in Robert's favourite mug. The television in the living room was playing the morning news. Emma's backpack was by the front door, packed for summer camp. Tyler's toy trucks were scattered across the floor, exactly where he'd left them the night before. But the family was gone. Not just gone, but vanished in a way that defied explanation. Their car was still in the driveway. Their wallets, purses, and identification were all in their usual places. The back door was locked from the inside. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had even been in the house except the family themselves. The initial police investigation treated it as a potential kidnapping, but that theory quickly fell apart. There was no ransom demand, no threatening phone calls, no history of family disputes or financial troubles that might explain their disappearance. The Hendricks were, by all accounts, a happy family with no enemies and no reason to suddenly abandon their life. What made the case even stranger was what investigators discovered when they expanded their search. The family's cell phones were all still in the house, but when police checked the call records, they found something impossible. The last calls made from each phone were to numbers that didn't exist. Not disconnected numbers or wrong numbers, but sequences that weren't assigned to any carrier and couldn't have connected to anything. The bank where Robert worked confirmed that he hadn't shown any unusual behavior in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. His computer showed no suspicious internet searches, no travel bookings, no indication he was planning to leave town. Margaret's classroom was set up for the fall semester, with lesson plans already prepared and decorations hanging on the walls. But here's where the case takes a turn into the truly bizarre. Security cameras in the downtown area showed the family walking together on Main Street at 9:47 a.m. on July 15th, just 13 minutes before Lisa arrived at their house. They appeared relaxed and normal, stopping to look in shop windows and talking casually with each other. The problem? Their house was a 15-minute drive from downtown, and their car never left the driveway. Investigators pored over every frame of security footage from the surrounding area, looking for any clue about how the family might have traveled between downtown and their home. They found nothing, no taxi pickups, no buses, no other vehicles that could have transported them. The family simply appeared downtown and then, impossibly, was gone from their house 13 minutes later. The FBI was called in after local police exhausted every conventional lead. Federal agents interviewed hundreds of people, analyzed every piece of physical evidence, and constructed detailed timelines of the family's activities. They found absolutely nothing that explained what happened to the Hendricks family. What they did find was even more disturbing. When agents interviewed neighbors and acquaintances, they began to notice inconsistencies in people's memories of the family. Some remembered Emma as having brown hair, others recalled it being blonde. Tyler's age varied depending on who was asked. Even basic facts about Robert's job and Margaret's teaching assignment seemed to shift from person to person. It was as if the family's existence was somehow becoming unstable, their very reality fading from the memories of those who knew them. 5 years after the disappearance, investigators made one final, chilling discovery. When they returned to examine the house, which had been sealed as evidence, they found that family photos throughout the home were beginning to fade, not from age or sun exposure, but selectively. The images of the family members were growing dimmer while everything else in the photographs remained clear and vibrant. The Hendricks case remains open, but no new leads have emerged. The house still sits empty, and locals report that sometimes, late at night, you can see lights moving through the windows. But when police investigate these reports, they always find the house dark and empty, with no signs of entry or disturbance. Case number 2, The Collector. Our second case takes us to the world of art and antiquities, where a mysterious figure, known only as the Collector, has been acquiring impossible objects for over 3 decades. It started in 1991 when the prestigious Whitmore Auction House in New York received an anonymous consignment of what appeared to be ancient artifacts. The items included pottery shards with hieroglyphs that didn't match any known writing system, jewelry crafted from metals that couldn't be identified, and most puzzling of all, paintings that seemed to move when viewed from certain angles. The anonymous consignor provided authentication documents that appeared legitimate, complete with detailed provenance and expert certifications. The auction house's own specialist confirmed that the items appeared to be genuinely ancient, despite their unusual properties. But when researchers attempted to verify the documentation, they discovered something impossible. The museums and archaeological sites referenced in the provenance papers didn't exist. The expert signatures belonged to people who had died years before the certificates were supposedly issued. The chemical composition of the metals used in the jewellery didn't match any known elements or alloys. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a leading expert in ancient civilizations who was brought in to examine the artifacts, described her experience in terms that still send chills through the archaeological community. She reported that while studying one of the pottery shards under magnification, she observed the hieroglyphs actually changing, rearranging themselves into new patterns as she watched. When she attempted to photograph this phenomenon, her camera malfunctioned in ways that technical experts couldn't explain. The images that were captured showed not the artifacts themselves, but scenes of places that didn't exist on Earth. Landscapes with impossible geometry, skies filled with stars, arranged in patterns that defied known astronomy, and structures that seemed to extend beyond the boundaries of the photograph itself. The collector, as investigators dubbed this mysterious figure, continued to consign items to auction houses around the world. Each collection was more bizarre than the last. There were musical instruments that produced sounds at frequencies human ears couldn't detect, but that somehow induced powerful emotional responses in listeners. Books written in languages that linguists couldn't classify, containing knowledge that seemed to come from the future rather than the past. Most disturbing of all were the portraits, paintings of people who appeared to be looking directly at the viewer, no matter what angle the artwork was viewed from, but these weren't clever optical illusions or artistic techniques. When examined under laboratory conditions, the eyes in the paintings actually tracked movement, following observers around the room with an intelligence that suggested awareness. Law enforcement agencies across multiple countries launched investigations into the collector's identity, but every lead led to dead ends. The money transfers were traced to accounts that disappeared as soon as investigators attempted to access them. The shipping addresses led to buildings that were demolished years earlier, or locations that had never existed at all. The most unsettling aspect of the collector case isn't just the impossible nature of the artifacts themselves, but what happens to the people who acquire them. Within months of purchasing items from the collector's consignments, buyers began reporting strange experiences, dreams of places they'd never been, knowledge of things they'd never studied, and, most disturbing of all, the gradual realization that their own memories were becoming unreliable. Several buyers attempted to return their purchases, only to discover that the auction houses had no record of the transactions. Credit card statements showed the charges, but when contacted, the auction houses claimed they had never handled such items and had no knowledge of the collector. Dr. Hartwell, whose research into the collector's artifacts consumed her career for over a decade, disappeared in 2018. Her laboratory was found empty, with all research materials gone. Security footage showed her entering the building on her final day, but she was never seen leaving. The only clue was a note left on her desk, written in her handwriting but containing symbols that matched the hieroglyphs from the collector's pottery shards. The note, when finally decoded by teams at Dreamvault Mysteries, working with linguistic experts, contained a single chilling message. They're not artifacts, they're invitations. To this day, items believed to have originated from the collector continue to surface at auctions and private sales around the world. Authentication experts have learned to recognize certain telltale signs of the collector's work, but the artifacts themselves remain as mysterious as ever. Each new discovery raises the same questions. Who is the collector? Where do these impossible objects come from? And perhaps most importantly, what is the collector's ultimate purpose? The investigation continues, but those brave enough to pursue it often find that the deeper they dig, the more their own reality begins to shift and change around them. Case number 3, the frequency. In the spring of 2007, radio operators across the globe began picking up a signal that shouldn't exist. Not a typical radio transmission, but something far more unsettling. A frequency that seemed to broadcast directly into people's minds, carrying messages that bypassed the ears entirely and implanted thoughts that felt like memories of experiences that never happened. The phenomenon was first documented by amateur radio enthusiast Marcus Chen in Portland, Oregon. Chen had been scanning frequencies late one night when he stumbled across what he initially thought was a numbers station, those mysterious shortwave broadcasts used by intelligence agencies to communicate with operatives. But this was different. Instead of numbers or coded messages, Chen found himself experiencing vivid memories of walking through a city he'd never visited. Streets lined with buildings that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, populated by people whose faces shifted and changed each time he tried to focus on them. The experience was so realistic that when it ended, Chen was convinced he had somehow fallen asleep at his radio. But when he checked his equipment, he discovered something that made his blood run cold. His radio wasn't even turned on. Chen spent the following weeks documenting every occurrence of what he began calling the frequency. Each time it happened, the experience was different, but equally vivid. He found himself reliving moments from lives that weren't his own, experiencing emotions tied to events that existed only in these impossible memories. What disturbed him most was how real these experiences felt compared to his actual memories, which seemed pale and uncertain in comparison. Word of Chen's discovery spread through amateur radio communities, and soon reports began flooding in from operators around the world. The pattern was always the same. People would be scanning frequencies when suddenly they'd find themselves immersed in experiences that felt more real than reality itself. But unlike Chen's urban visions, each person's experiences were unique, tailored somehow to their individual psyche. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a neurologist at Johns Hopkins who specialized in memory disorders, became involved when several of her patients began reporting similar experiences. These weren't radio operators, but ordinary people who claimed to be receiving these transmissions without any equipment at all. They described the same phenomenon, memories of impossible places and events that felt more authentic than their own lives. Martinez's initial skepticism evaporated when she volunteered to be a test subject during one of Chen's documented frequency events. Connected to an EEG machine, she experienced what she later described as the most profound and terrifying 15 minutes of her life. She found herself in a vast library where the books wrote themselves as she watched, their pages filling with text in languages that had never existed but which she somehow understood perfectly. The knowledge contained in these books revealed truths about the nature of reality that her conscious mind couldn't retain once the experience ended, leaving her with only the haunting sensation that everything she believed about existence was fundamentally wrong. The EEG readings during Martinez's experience showed brain activity patterns that defied medical understanding. Her neural activity spiked to levels that should have induced seizures or unconsciousness, yet she remained fully aware and responsive throughout the event. Most disturbing of all, the readings showed activity in regions of her brain that had been dormant since birth, areas that neurologists believed were evolutionary remnants with no function in modern humans. Government agencies began taking notice when military communications started experiencing interference from the frequency. Classified transmissions were being disrupted not by traditional signal jamming, but by something that seemed to rewrite the messages at the source. Orders sent from command centers would arrive at their destinations completely altered, containing instructions for operations that had never been planned and referencing events that had never occurred. The Department of Defense assembled a task force to investigate the frequency, but their findings only deepened the mystery. Sophisticated direction-finding equipment couldn't locate the source of the transmissions. The signal appeared to originate from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, as if it were being broadcast from outside conventional space-time. Team members working on the investigation began reporting their own spontaneous experiences with the frequency, even when they were nowhere near radio equipment. Dr. James Reeves, the task force's lead scientist, documented his experiences in classified reports that were later leaked to researchers at Dream Vault Mysteries. In his final report before the project was abruptly terminated, Reeves wrote, "The frequency isn't a radio transmission in any conventional sense. It appears to be something that exists in the gaps between thoughts, in the spaces where consciousness touches something larger than itself. Each exposure leaves subjects with the unshakable conviction that they've glimpsed the true nature of reality, but they can never quite remember what they've seen." The most chilling aspect of Reeves's research was his discovery that the frequency was getting stronger. Analysis of recorded instances showed that the experiences were becoming more vivid and lasting longer with each occurrence. People who had multiple exposures began reporting that the boundary between their real memories and their frequency experiences was becoming increasingly blurred. Some subjects claimed that their frequency experiences were beginning to bleed into their waking lives. They would recognize locations from their impossible memories in real places they visited, or encounter people whose faces matched those from their transmitted experiences. A few reported that they could sometimes access the frequency voluntarily, simply by concentrating on a particular mental state they'd learned to achieve. In 2015, Chen made a final, desperate attempt to trace the frequency to its source. Using equipment he'd modified based on patterns he'd observed in his years of documentation, he attempted to transmit back along the signal path. His last communication to fellow researchers was a text message sent at 3:47 a.m. "I found where it's coming from. It's not somewhere else. It's somewhere else." Chen was found in his radio room the next morning, alive, but in a catatonic state. He remained unresponsive for 3 weeks before suddenly awakening with no memory of the previous month. When shown his research and equipment, he claimed to have no knowledge of the frequency, and insisted that someone else must have been using his radio room. Most disturbing of all, when researchers played recordings of his own voice documenting frequency experiences, Chen showed no recognition and became increasingly agitated, insisting that the voice belonged to someone else. The frequency continues to appear sporadically around the globe, but the pattern of occurrences has changed. Instead of random encounters, it now seems to target specific individuals, often those involved in consciousness research or studies of anomalous phenomena. Each new case adds to the growing body of evidence that the frequency represents something far beyond human understanding, a form of communication from intelligences that exist outside our conventional perception of reality. Case number 4, the Sleepless Town. Sometimes the most unsettling mysteries are the ones that affect entire communities, transforming ordinary places into something nightmarish. Such is the case with the town of Millbrook, Kansas, population 3247, where in the autumn of 2009, something happened that sleep researchers still can't explain. It began with Martha Williamson, a 67-year-old retired librarian who had always been an early riser. On October 3rd, she simply didn't go to bed, not because she was sick or anxious or had consumed too much caffeine, but because the very concept of sleep seemed to have vanished from her mind. When her concerned neighbours checked on her after she'd been seen tending her garden at 3 in the morning, Martha seemed confused by their worry. "Sleep?" she asked them, as if the word was foreign. "Why would I need to sleep?" Within 48 hours, the phenomenon had spread to Martha's immediate neighbours. then to their neighbours, then to entire blocks. By the end of the week, roughly half of Millbrook's population had simply stopped sleeping, and the other half were beginning to show the same symptoms. But here's what made medical experts take notice. None of the affected individuals showed any signs of sleep deprivation. They weren't tired, irritable, or experiencing the cognitive impairment that normally comes with extended wakefulness. If anything, they seemed more alert and energetic than usual. Their minds were sharper, their reflexes quicker, their overall health improved. Dr. Amanda Foster, a sleep specialist from the University of Kansas Medical Center, was among the first researchers to arrive in Millbrook. What she found challenged everything she understood about human biology. Blood tests showed that the affected residents had no detectable levels of adenosine, the chemical that builds up in the brain and creates the sensation of tiredness. Their brains showed none of the typical markers of sleep debt or circadian rhythm disruption. Most puzzling of all, when connected to EEG machines, the sleepless residents showed brainwave patterns unlike anything in medical literature. Their neural activity remained in a state that resembled REM sleep, even while they were fully awake and functional. It was as if their brains had learned to dream while conscious, processing the restorative functions of sleep without ever losing awareness. The unaffected residents of Millbrook began reporting increasingly vivid and disturbing dreams. These weren't typical nightmares, but shared experiences where multiple people would have identical dreams on the same night. In these dreams, they found themselves walking through a version of Millbrook where the sleepless residents moved through the streets like ghosts, their eyes reflecting a strange light that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the physical world. Children were among the first to notice that the sleepless adults were changing in subtle ways. They moved differently, spoke in slightly altered cadences, and seemed to know things they shouldn't know. 7-year-old Tommy Chen told his still sleeping parents that Mrs. Peterson from down the street had told him about events from his day at school, even though she had never left her house and had no way of knowing what had happened. As weeks passed, the division between the sleepless and the sleeping residents became more pronounced. The sleepless began gathering in groups, standing silently in parks and parking lots throughout the night, their eyes reflecting that same strange light the children had noticed. They claimed to be having conversations, but observers heard only silence. Dr. Foster's research team documented increasingly bizarre behaviors among both groups. The sleepless residents began demonstrating knowledge they couldn't have acquired through normal means. Martha Williamson, the librarian who had never studied astronomy, began drawing detailed star charts that accurately depicted celestial configurations visible only through powerful telescopes. The sleeping residents, meanwhile, found their shared dreams becoming more complex and detailed. They began mapping out areas of Dream Millbrook that didn't correspond to the real town, discovering buildings and landmarks that had never existed. Most unsettling of all, they started encountering people in their dreams who claimed to be the original residents of Millbrook, inhabitants who had disappeared long before the current population arrived. Research teams from Dream Vault Mysteries spent months in Millbrook, documenting the phenomenon and trying to understand its cause. What they discovered was that the town's sleep disruption wasn't random, but followed a specific pattern that radiated outward from a particular location, the old Millbrook Cemetery, where the town's original settlers had been buried in the 1880s. Ground-penetrating radar revealed that the cemetery contained far more graves than records indicated, and many of the burial sites showed evidence of unusual electromagnetic activity. Soil samples from around the most active graves contained microscopic crystalline structures that didn't match any known minerals. The most disturbing discovery came when researchers realized that the sleepless residents were beginning to synchronize not just their behaviors, but their thoughts. Brain scans showed that their neural patterns were becoming increasingly similar, as if their individual consciousness were gradually merging into something collective. By the spring of 2010, the entire population of Millbrook had stopped sleeping. The last holdouts simply woke up one morning with no memory of having slept, and no understanding of why they ever needed to. The town continued to function normally during daylight hours, but at night all 3,247 residents would gather in the town square, standing in perfect silence, their eyes reflecting that otherworldly light. Attempts to study the nighttime gatherings proved impossible. Recording equipment would malfunction, and researchers who tried to observe the assemblies would find themselves overcome by an irresistible urge to sleep, often experiencing shared dreams that seemed to be messages from the gathered townspeople. Today, Millbrook remains a functioning community, though visitors often report feeling unsettled by the residents' strange habits and the town's eerily pristine condition. The people are friendly and helpful during the day, but as sunset approaches, they politely but firmly encourage all outsiders to leave. Those brave enough to drive past Millbrook at night report seeing thousands of points of light moving through the darkness, as if every resident were carrying lanterns. But when morning comes, no one in the town has any memory of leaving their homes or carrying lights. The Millbrook case remains under investigation by sleep researchers and neurologists around the world, but the town's residents have become increasingly resistant to outside study. They insist they're perfectly healthy and happy, and medical tests seem to support their claims. Whatever happened to them has apparently become their new normal, a transformation that's allowed them to transcend one of humanity's most basic biological needs. But the question that haunts researchers isn't whether the residents of Millbrook are healthy, it's whether they're still human. Case number 5, the memory merchants. The fifth case on our list takes us into the realm of human consciousness itself, where a group of individuals with an impossible ability have been operating in the shadows for over 2 decades. They call themselves memory merchants, and what they do challenges everything we understand about the nature of human experience and identity. The first documented encounter with a memory merchant occurred in 2001 when Detective Sarah Coleman of the Chicago Police Department was investigating a series of bizarre theft reports. Victims claimed that valuable items had been stolen from their homes, but security footage showed no signs of break-ins, and the victims themselves had no memory of the thefts occurring. What made these cases extraordinary wasn't the missing objects, but what the victims remembered in place of their actual experiences. Each person reported vivid, detailed memories of events that had never happened. A businessman remembered spending the evening his Rolex was stolen, having dinner with his deceased father, reliving conversations they'd had when he was a child. A woman whose jewelry collection vanished recalled the same night as a perfect evening with her estranged sister, complete with emotional reconciliation and shared laughter. Detective Coleman's investigation led her to a coffee shop in downtown Chicago, where she met a man who introduced himself only as Marcus. Unremarkable in appearance, Marcus possessed an ability that defied rational explanation. He could, he claimed, remove memories from one person and implant them into another, trading experiences like commodities in a marketplace of consciousness. Marcus demonstrated his ability by asking Coleman to think of her most treasured childhood memory. As she focused on a Christmas morning when she was 7 years old, Marcus reached across the table and briefly touched her hand. Instantly, the memory vanished from her mind completely, not forgotten or suppressed, but erased as if it had never existed at all. In its place, Coleman found herself with a perfect recollection of climbing a mountain she'd never seen, feeling the satisfaction of reaching a summit she'd never attempted, sharing the accomplishment with friends whose faces she could see clearly but whom she'd never met. The memory felt as real and meaningful as any experience from her actual life. Marcus explained that he was part of a network of individuals who had discovered their ability to manipulate human memory through methods they couldn't fully understand themselves. They operated as merchants, trading memories between clients who sought to experience things they'd never had or to forget things they couldn't bear to remember. The business model was disturbing in its simplicity. Wealthy clients would pay enormous sums to acquire the memories of extraordinary experiences. Mountain climbers, world travelers, accomplished artists, and even people who had experienced profound love or spiritual awakening would sell their memories to those who could afford to purchase them. But the memory merchants didn't just deal in positive experiences. They also offered a service for those haunted by trauma, war veterans struggling with PTSD, accident survivors tormented by recurring nightmares, or individuals consumed by guilt over past mistakes. For the right price, these memories could be removed and transferred to volunteers who accepted payment for taking on the psychological burden of experiences that weren't their own. Dr. Michael Thornton, a neuroscientist at Northwestern University, became involved when several of his patients began reporting impossible memory inconsistencies. Brain scans of individuals who claimed to have had their memories altered by memory merchants showed neural patterns that shouldn't exist. Regions of the brain associated with specific memories showed activity patterns that didn't match the experiences the patients described. Even more disturbing, some patients showed evidence of memories that existed in their brains but weren't accessible to their conscious minds. Dr. Thornton described it as neurological archaeology, finding layers of experience buried beneath the surface of consciousness like sediment in geological formations. The memory merchants seemed to operate according to rules that even they didn't fully understand. Marcus explained to Detective Coleman that the ability to transfer memories wasn't something that could be learned or taught. Individuals either possessed it naturally or they didn't. And even among those who had the gift, the strength and precision of their abilities varied dramatically. Some memory merchants could only work with recent memories, transferring experiences from the past few days or weeks. Others could reach deep into childhood, extracting moments from decades earlier. The most skilled among them claimed to be able to access genetic memories, transferring not just personal experiences, but inherited traits and instincts passed down through generations. The investigation into memory merchants revealed a hidden economy built entirely on human experience. High-end clients would bid on particularly desirable memories in underground auctions. The childhood recollections of renowned artists, the creative inspirations of famous writers, the emotional experiences of individuals who had lived extraordinary lives, all became commodities to be bought and sold. But the market also had a darker side. Criminals would pay to have their memories of illegal activities removed, creating perfect alibis by genuinely having no recollection of their crimes. Witnesses to sensitive events would find their memories purchased by interested parties, leaving them unable to testify about things they could no longer remember witnessing. The psychological impact on both buyers and sellers was profound and often unexpected. People who purchased memories found that the experiences came with emotional attachments and personality traits that weren't their own. A businessman who bought the memories of a mountain climber found himself compulsively planning outdoor adventures despite having no previous interest in nature. A woman who acquired the recollections of a professional musician discovered she had developed musical abilities she'd never possessed. Sellers often experienced identity crises as significant portions of their life experiences were removed. Without the memories that had shaped their personalities, they found themselves becoming different people, sometimes losing the very characteristics that had made them unique or valuable to others. Dr. Thornton's research team at DreamVault Mysteries discovered that the effects of memory transfer weren't permanent. Over time, the brain seemed to recognize that implanted memories didn't belong and would begin to reject them like a biological immune response. Purchased memories would fade, while traces of original experiences would sometimes resurface unexpectedly. This temporal limitation meant that clients often returned to memory merchants repeatedly, requiring regular refreshers to maintain their acquired experiences. Some individuals became addicted to the process, constantly seeking new memories to replace those that were fading, creating a dependency that memory merchants were happy to exploit. The most unsettling discovery was that memory merchants themselves seemed to be changing as a result of their abilities. Long-term practitioners showed signs of memory fragmentation, their own experiences becoming jumbled with fragments of the thousands of memories they had transferred over the years. Marcus, during his final interview with Detective Coleman, admitted that he was no longer certain which of his childhood memories were actually his own. Government agencies attempted to investigate memory merchants, but the nature of their abilities made prosecution nearly impossible. How do you prove a crime when the victim has no memory of it occurring? How do you build a case when evidence consists of experiences that exist only in consciousness? The memory merchants continue to operate, moving frequently and using their abilities to alter the memories of law enforcement officials who get too close to their operations. They've become ghosts in the machine of human consciousness, trading in the very essence of what makes us who we are. Case number 6. The Backwards House. In the suburban neighborhood of Oakwood Heights, Illinois, stands a house that has defied the laws of physics for over 15 years. From the outside, 1247 Elm Street appears to be a perfectly ordinary two-story colonial home with a white picket fence and a well-maintained garden. But step inside, and you'll discover that this house exists in reverse temporal flow, where cause follows effect and endings precede beginnings. The phenomenon was first documented in 2008 when the Morrison family moved into the house after purchasing it at a price that seemed too good to be true. The previous owners, the Hendersons, had sold it quickly after living there for only 3 months, citing incompatibility with the home's unique characteristics in their listing. Jennifer Morrison, a freelance journalist, began documenting strange occurrences almost immediately after moving in. On their first night, she woke to find dinner dishes clean and put away in the kitchen, despite having left them dirty in the sink the evening before. When she mentioned this to her husband David, he insisted they had cleaned them together, providing detailed memories of washing and drying each plate. The inconsistencies escalated quickly. Mail would arrive already opened and read, with Jennifer having clear memories of opening it and discussing its contents with David, even though she had no recollection of the actual moment of opening. Phone calls would end before they began, with both parties remembering complete conversations that somehow occurred in reverse. Dr. Patricia Wells, a physicist from the University of Chicago specializing in temporal mechanics, was contacted by the Morrison family after 3 weeks of increasingly bizarre experiences. What she found in the house challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of time and causality. Using specialized equipment designed to measure temporal flow, Dr. Wells discovered that time inside 1247 Elm Street moved in the opposite direction from the outside world. Events that would normally occur in sequence, cause leading to effect, happened in reverse. Water flowed upward from drains, candles unlit themselves while growing longer, and food cooked itself backwards from finished meals to raw ingredients. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't the physical reversals, but how the phenomenon affected human consciousness. People inside the house experienced their thoughts and memories in reverse chronological order. They would remember conversations before having them, feel emotions about events that hadn't yet occurred, and make decisions based on knowledge they wouldn't acquire until later. Jennifer Morrison's journal entries from this period, analysed by researchers at Dreamvault Mysteries, show the psychological strain of living in temporal reverse. Early entries describe her growing anxiety about events she couldn't yet remember experiencing. Later entries, written before the earlier ones from the house's perspective, show her relief at resolving conflicts that, from her normal timeline, hadn't yet occurred. The most chilling entry, dated 3 weeks before the family moved into the house, describes Jennifer's detailed memories of their decision to leave, complete with emotional goodbyes to the house and specific reasons for their departure that wouldn't become apparent until much later. Dr. Wells's research revealed that the temporal reversal affected different people to varying degrees. Children seem more adaptable to the backwards flow, quickly learning to navigate their reversed experiences with minimal distress. Adults, particularly those with rigid thinking patterns, experience severe psychological disorientation that sometimes required medical intervention. The house's effect extended beyond its physical boundaries. Neighbours began reporting temporal anomalies in their own homes. Clocks would run backwards for brief periods, aging processes would temporarily reverse, and people would occasionally experience flashes of future memories involving interactions with the Morrison family. The source of the temporal distortion was traced to the house's basement, where Dr. Wells discovered an unusual crystalline formation growing from the foundation. The crystals didn't match any known mineral composition and seemed to generate a localized field that reversed the flow of entropy within the house's boundaries. Carbon dating of the crystals produced impossible results. Different sections of the formation showed ages ranging from thousands of years old to dates in the future that hadn't yet occurred. It was as if the crystals existed outside normal temporal flow, creating a bubble of reverse time around themselves. The Morrison family's attempts to live normally in the backwards house became increasingly difficult as they adapted to the reversed causality. They would find themselves having arguments about events that hadn't happened yet, making plans based on future memories and experiencing the emotional aftermath of situations before encountering the situations themselves. Jennifer's final journal entry, written on their last day in the house but describing events from their first week, reveals the ultimate psychological toll. Living backwards isn't just confusing, it's isolating. You can never share the present moment with anyone because you're always living in their past or their future. Every conversation is a memory of something that's already over before it begins. The Morrison family moved out after 2 months, but the temporal effects followed them for weeks afterward. They would occasionally slip back into reversed thinking patterns, remembering conversations with their new neighbours before meeting them, or experiencing nostalgia for their new home before fully settling in. The house has remained empty since the Morrisons' departure. Real estate agents report that potential buyers who spend more than a few minutes inside begin experiencing temporal disorientation. Some leave with memories of living in the house for years, complete with detailed recollections of decorating rooms and hosting family gatherings that never occurred. Local authorities have placed the house under investigation, but researchers who attempt to study it for extended periods invariably experience the same temporal reversal effects. Most disturbing are reports from investigators who claim to remember completing their research and publishing their findings, despite having just begun their work. The backwards house continues to exist in its temporal bubble, a place where effect precedes cause and endings come before beginnings. It stands as a monument to the mysteries of time itself, challenging our most basic assumptions about the nature of reality and the linear progression of existence. Case number 7, the Emotion Eaters. The 7th case brings us face to face with entities that feed on human emotion in ways that science cannot explain. These beings, dubbed emotion eaters by researchers, first came to widespread attention in 2012 when therapist Dr. Amanda Reynolds noticed a disturbing pattern among her patients in Seattle, Washington. Patients who had been making steady progress in addressing depression, anxiety, and trauma began experiencing sudden and complete emotional numbness. Not the gradual improvement that comes with successful therapy, but an instantaneous absence of all feeling that left them functionally empty shells of their former selves. The pattern was always the same. Patients would describe waking up one morning with the sensation that something essential had been drained from them during the night. They retained all their memories and intellectual understanding of their emotions, but the feelings themselves were simply gone. They could remember being sad or happy or angry, but couldn't access those emotions anymore. Dr. Reynolds initially suspected a previously unknown neurological condition, but brain scans of affected patients showed no abnormalities. Their neural chemistry appeared normal, their hormone levels were balanced, and their cognitive functions remained intact. They had simply been emptied of their capacity to feel. The breakthrough came when patient Michael Chen reported seeing something in his bedroom the night his emotions disappeared. He described waking to find a figure standing beside his bed, roughly human in shape but composed of what looked like shifting shadows. The entity had its hand pressed against his forehead, and Chen could feel something being drawn out of him like liquid through a straw. When Chen tried to move or speak, he found himself paralyzed, able only to watch as the shadow figure fed on whatever it was extracting from his mind. The experience lasted several minutes, during which Chen felt his emotional capacity draining away until nothing remained but a hollow awareness of what he had lost. Similar reports began coming from therapists and psychiatrists across the Pacific Northwest. Patients described identical encounters with shadow figures who appeared in bedrooms, hospital rooms, and even therapy offices to feed on human emotion. The entities seemed particularly drawn to individuals experiencing intense feelings, whether positive or negative. Dr. Maria Santos, a researcher in paranormal psychology, partnered with Dr. Reynolds to investigate the phenomenon. Using thermal imaging cameras and electromagnetic field detectors, they documented several encounters with the emotion eaters. The entities appeared as cold spots that moved with apparent intelligence, creating localized temperature drops of up to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Most disturbing was the discovery that the emotion eaters weren't simply draining emotions randomly. They displayed preferences for certain types of feelings and seemed to target individuals whose emotional states offered the richest feeding opportunities. Patients experiencing profound grief, intense love, or overwhelming fear were most likely to be visited by these entities. The feeding process appeared to be addictive for both the entities and, bizarrely, for some of their victims. A small percentage of patients who had been drained of emotion reported feeling a strange compulsion to seek out the shadow figures again. They described the feeding experience as both terrifying and oddly euphoric, like a drug that provided relief from the burden of feeling while leaving them craving the intensity they had lost. Dr. Santos's research team discovered that the emotion eaters followed certain patterns in their hunting behavior. They were most active during periods of high emotional stress in communities, appearing in greater numbers during times of tragedy, celebration, or social upheaval. Major hospitals, psychiatric facilities, and funeral homes showed the highest concentration of sightings. The entities seemed to exist in a state between physical and non-physical reality. They could interact with the electromagnetic fields generated by human brains, but couldn't affect physical objects directly. Attempts to photograph them resulted in images that showed only distortions in light and shadow, as if the entities existed in wavelengths beyond normal human perception. The most chilling aspect of Dr. Santos's research was the discovery that the emotion eaters were becoming more efficient in their feeding. Early cases showed patients retaining some capacity for feeling, with emotions slowly returning over weeks or months. More recent victims experienced complete and seemingly permanent emotional void, suggesting that the entities were evolving or learning more effective feeding techniques. Support groups formed for victims of emotion eater encounters, but these gatherings proved problematic. The concentration of emotionally drained individuals seemed to attract more entities, leading to secondary feeding events during group therapy sessions. Several support group leaders reported being targeted themselves, presumably because their empathetic responses to patient stories created rich emotional states for the entities to consume. The psychological impact on communities affected by emotion eater activity extended beyond direct victims. Family members and friends of those who had been drained reported their own emotional numbness, as if the entities feeding created expanding zones of emotional depletion. Children seem particularly vulnerable to these secondary effects, often losing their capacity for joy and wonder after prolonged exposure to emotionally drained family members. Research conducted by Dream Vault Mysteries revealed that the emotion eaters might represent an entirely new form of predator, one that had evolved to feed on the byproducts of human consciousness rather than physical flesh. The entities appeared to be highly intelligent, adapting their hunting strategies to maximize their feeding opportunities while avoiding detection by authorities. Government agencies began investigating the phenomenon after reports of emotion eater activity in military facilities and government buildings. The entity's ability to drain emotional responses from personnel posed significant security risks, particularly among individuals responsible for making critical decisions under pressure. The most recent developments in the emotion eater case suggest that the entities are organizing into more complex social structures. Multiple witnesses have reported seeing groups of shadow figures working together to drain entire households or therapy groups simultaneously. These coordinated feeding events leave entire families or social groups emotionally vacant, creating pockets of human numbness that spread through communities like a psychological contagion. Dr. Reynolds continues her research into methods for protecting potential victims and possibly restoring emotional capacity to those who have been drained. Her work has led to the development of electromagnetic shielding devices that seem to provide some protection against the entities, but the long-term effectiveness of these measures remains unknown. The emotion eaters represent perhaps the most insidious threat in our collection of unsolved cases. Unlike other mysteries that challenge our understanding of physics or biology, these entities attack the very essence of what makes us human, our capacity to feel, to empathize, and to experience the full spectrum of emotional life that gives meaning to our existence. The eighth case takes us deep into the realm of collective consciousness, where an entire psychiatric ward experienced shared delusions that turned out to be anything but delusional. At Riverside Mental Health Facility in Vermont, what began as routine treatment for severe psychological disorders transformed into something that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality and mental illness. Case number 8. The ward. Dr. Catherine Liu had worked in psychiatric medicine for over 20 years before accepting the position of head psychiatrist at Riverside in the fall of 2016. The facility housed 63 patients with various conditions ranging from severe depression to schizophrenia, and Dr. Liu was brought in to implement new treatment protocols that emphasized group therapy and community healing. What she discovered was that patients in Ward 7, the facility's most secure unit for individuals with severe psychotic disorders, had begun sharing identical hallucinations. Not similar experiences or related themes, but precise, detailed visions that multiple patients described in exactly the same way, down to specific visual details and sequential events. The shared hallucination centered around a place they called the Grey City, a vast urban landscape existing beneath the hospital, where beings of pure thought wandered through streets made of crystallized memories. Patients described navigating this underground metropolis during what appeared to be their sleeping hours, encountering other residents of Ward 7 and engaging in complex activities that felt more real than their waking lives. What made Dr. Liu take notice wasn't just the consistency of the reports, but the fact that patients were sharing information through their shared hallucinations that they couldn't possibly know in their normal state. Robert Martinez, a patient with severe autism who rarely spoke, provided detailed descriptions of conversations other patients had with their families, despite having no interaction with those individuals in the physical world. Sarah Thompson, diagnosed with catatonic schizophrenia, began drawing elaborate maps of the Grey City that matched perfectly with sketches created by other patients who had never seen her artwork. The maps showed a complex urban environment with landmarks, transportation systems, and residential areas that all patients could navigate with perfect accuracy during their shared experiences. Dr. Liu's initial assumption was that the patients were somehow communicating with each other during unsupervised moments, sharing details of a collective fantasy, but continuous monitoring revealed that the patients had no opportunity for such communication. They were kept in separate rooms, observed around the clock, and showed no signs of interaction during their waking hours. The breakthrough came when Dr. Liu decided to participate in the patient's group therapy sessions while connected to an EEG machine. During one particularly intense session, where patients were describing their most recent visit to the Grey City, her brain activity suddenly synchronized with theirs. For exactly 7 minutes and 32 seconds, all participants showed identical neural patterns while maintaining completely different states of consciousness. During those 7 minutes, Dr. Liu experienced something that would haunt her for the rest of her career. She found herself standing in a vast underground plaza, surrounded by towering structures that seemed to be constructed from human thoughts given physical form. The patients from Ward 7 were there, but they appeared completely lucid and healthy, their psychiatric symptoms entirely absent in this strange realm. They welcomed her as they would any visitor to their city, explaining that this was where they truly lived, where their minds were free from the constraints and chemical imbalances that plagued them in the physical world. In the Grey City, they told her, they weren't patients or victims of mental illness. They were explorers of consciousness, architects of reality, builders of a world where thought and will could reshape existence itself. The most disturbing revelation came when the patients showed Dr. Liu the city's central structure, a massive spire that extended both upward and downward beyond visual range. Inside the spire, they explained, were the true forms of every person in the physical world above, sleeping manifestations that dreamed they were living ordinary lives while their real selves existed in the Grey City. When Dr. Liu regained normal consciousness. She was left with perfect recall of her experience and a growing suspicion that what she had witnessed wasn't a shared hallucination, but access to some form of alternate reality. The patient's descriptions of her presence in their city matched her own memories exactly, including details of conversations and interactions that occurred during the 7-minute synchronized period. Research teams from Dreamvault Mysteries were brought in when Dr. Liu's reports reached the attention of consciousness researchers. What they discovered was that the shared experiences weren't limited to Ward 7. Patients throughout Riverside were beginning to report visits to the Grey City, and the population of the underground metropolis was growing with each new participant. Even more unsettling was the discovery that some patients were beginning to prefer their existence in the Grey City to their lives in the physical world. They would spend their waking hours in a state of minimal engagement, clearly waiting for sleep so they could return to what they considered their real home. Some began refusing medication, claiming that psychiatric drugs interfered with their ability to access the city clearly. The phenomenon spread beyond Riverside when former patients, discharged and living in the community, continued to report visits to the Grey City. They maintained contact with current patients through their shared experiences, creating a network of consciousness that transcended physical location. Support groups formed among these individuals, but unlike typical patient support groups, these meetings focused on comparing notes about their explorations of the underground city. Dr. Liu's research revealed that the Grey City wasn't static, but was actively growing and evolving. New districts would appear as more people gained access, and the city's infrastructure would adapt to accommodate its expanding population. The patients had become urban planners of consciousness, creating transportation systems, residential areas, and public spaces through collective visualization. The most chilling development came when patients began reporting that residents of the Grey City were starting to influence events in the physical world. They described council meetings where decisions were made about the lives of their surface selves, and claimed that many of the choices and behaviors exhibited by people in the normal world were actually being directed by their counterparts in the underground city. Several patients insisted that what most people considered reality was actually a form of prison, a limiting construct that prevented access to the true nature of existence represented by the Grey City. They viewed their psychiatric diagnoses not as mental illness, but as evidence of their ability to perceive beyond the boundaries that constrained ordinary consciousness. Government interest in the Riverside case intensified when patients began demonstrating knowledge they couldn't have acquired through normal means. They provided accurate descriptions of classified government facilities, detailed information about ongoing research projects, and even personal details about the lives of investigators studying their case. When questioned about the source of this information, they claimed it was freely available to anyone with access to the Grey City's information networks. The case took a darker turn when Dr. Liu herself began experiencing unsolicited visits to the Grey City outside of research contexts. She would find herself in the underground metropolis during her normal sleep, unable to control when these experiences occurred. The patients welcomed her each time, but she began to notice that her personality and decision-making in the physical world were being influenced by conversations and experiences in the city. More disturbing still, Dr. Liu started recognizing people in the Grey City who weren't psychiatric patients. Ordinary individuals from her daily life appeared as residents of the underground city, living what seemed to be their true lives, while their surface selves remained unaware of their deeper existence. She began to suspect that the Grey City wasn't a shared hallucination at all, but a glimpse into a level of reality that most people never consciously access. The Riverside case remains active, with researchers struggling to determine whether they're studying a breakthrough in consciousness research or something far more dangerous. The patients continue to thrive in their shared reality, showing marked improvement in their surface world functioning, while maintaining that their true lives exist elsewhere. Case number 9. The temporal echoes. Our 9th case involves a phenomenon that challenges our understanding of time itself, where past events seem to replay themselves with terrifying accuracy in specific locations around the world. These aren't mere ghostly apparitions or residual hauntings, but what appear to be actual temporal ruptures that allow glimpses into moments from history that refuse to remain buried. The phenomenon was first systematically documented by Dr. James Morrison, a temporal physicist from MIT, who was investigating reports of time slips in the historic district of Salem, Massachusetts. Local residents had been reporting incidents where they would witness scenes from the past playing out in real time, complete with period-appropriate clothing, speech patterns, and even weather conditions that didn't match the current environment. The incidents weren't random, but seemed to cluster around specific dates and locations with historical significance. The most frequent occurrences happened near the site of the Salem witch trials, where witnesses reported seeing the actual trials taking place, complete with judges, accused witches, and crowds of townspeople that appeared solid and real until they suddenly vanished. Dr. Morrison's investigation revealed that these temporal echoes weren't limited to Salem. Similar reports were coming from battlefields, historical landmarks, and sites of significant trauma around the world. The common thread was that these locations had experienced events of such emotional intensity that they seemed to have left permanent impressions on the fabric of time itself. What made these incidents particularly unsettling was their interactive nature. Witnesses reported being able to hear conversations from the past, smell the cooking fires and unwashed bodies of historical periods, and even feel temperature changes that matched the weather conditions of the time being witnessed. Some individuals claimed to have made eye contact with people from these temporal echoes, who seemed momentarily aware of their presence before the scene dissolved. The most documented case occurred in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where Civil War reenactors participating in a memorial event suddenly found themselves witnessing the actual Battle of Gettysburg. The reenactors reported that their carefully planned historical recreation was interrupted when real soldiers from 1863 began appearing among their ranks, fighting and dying with a desperation and terror that no performance could capture. Video footage from the event, analysed by researchers at Dreamvault Mysteries, shows disturbing anomalies. Modern participants can be seen reacting to and interacting with figures that aren't visible on camera, but digital enhancement reveals shadow-like impressions that suggest the presence of additional people in period uniforms. Audio recordings captured the sounds of musket fire, artillery explosions, and screaming that don't correspond to any sounds made by the reenactors. Dr. Morrison developed specialized equipment designed to detect temporal distortions, and his readings at various historical sites confirmed that these locations showed measurable abnormalities in the local flow of time. Areas where temporal echoes occurred most frequently displayed what he termed chronological scarring, where the normal linear progression of time showed permanent distortions. The psychological impact on witnesses to temporal echoes proved profound and long-lasting. Many reported developing an overwhelming sense of historical responsibility, feeling personally connected to events they had witnessed from the past. Some became obsessed with researching the specific incidents they had experienced, often uncovering historical details that hadn't been previously documented, but which matched their witnessed events perfectly. More disturbing were cases where witnesses began experiencing what Dr. Morrison termed temporal bleeding, where memories and emotions from the echoed events began integrating with their own personal histories. A woman who witnessed a temporal echo of a 19th century factory fire began experiencing nightmares about industrial accidents she had never encountered, and developed an inexplicable fear of enclosed spaces despite having no prior claustrophobia. The phenomenon seemed to be intensifying over time, with temporal echoes becoming more frequent and more vivid. Locations that had previously shown only occasional incidents began experiencing daily occurrences, and the echoed events were extending beyond moments of trauma to include ordinary daily life from past eras. The most unsettling development was the discovery that some temporal echoes were beginning to influence present-day events. Witnesses reported that their interactions with figures from the past were somehow changing the nature of the echoed scenes, creating alterations that rippled forward into contemporary reality. Small changes in historical events witnessed through temporal echoes seem to be creating minor but measurable changes in the present world. Dr. Morrison's research team documented several instances where historical records seemed to shift following temporal echo incidents. Details about past events would change in written sources, photographs would show different scenes than they had before, and genealogical records would reflect alterations in family histories that witnesses swore had been different prior to their temporal experiences. Government agencies became involved when temporal echoes began occurring at classified historical sites, revealing details about past military operations that had been sealed for decades. Witnesses to these echoes reported seeing events that matched classified documents exactly, suggesting that the temporal distortions were accessing actual historical moments rather than collective memories or cultural impressions. The most recent and disturbing trend in temporal echo research is the appearance of echoes from the future. Witnesses at several locations have reported seeing scenes that appear to be from times yet to come, showing advanced technology, environmental changes, and social conditions that don't currently exist. These future echoes are less stable than historical ones, often fragmentary and difficult to interpret, but they suggest that the temporal scarring effect works in both directions along the timeline. Attempts to study temporal echoes directly have proven dangerous for researchers. Extended exposure to areas with high chronological scarring seems to destabilize personal timelines, causing researchers to experience their own memories out of sequence and sometimes to forget entire periods of their lives while gaining memories of events they never experienced. The temporal echoes phenomenon represents one of the most challenging mysteries in our collection, because it suggests that time itself may not be as stable as we assume. If past events can replay themselves with such accuracy, and if present-day observers can influence historical occurrences, then the linear nature of cause and effect that underpins our understanding of reality may be fundamentally flawed. Case number 10. The final silence. Our final case is perhaps the most disturbing of all, involving a phenomenon that researchers at Dream Vault Mysteries have dubbed the final silence. This isn't a single incident, but a growing pattern of occurrences where sound itself seems to be disappearing from specific locations, creating zones of absolute acoustic vacuum that expand outward like an infection of nothingness. The first documented case of final silence occurred in 2019 in the small town of Harmony Ridge, Colorado. Local resident Maria Santos was walking her dog through the town park when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Despite being surrounded by typical park activity, children playing, dogs barking, wind rustling through trees, she could hear absolutely nothing. Not muffled sounds or distant noise, but complete and total silence that seemed to exist within a perfect sphere around her. She could see her dog's mouth moving in what should have been barking, could observe children's mouths open in what should have been laughter or screams, could watch tree branches swaying in what should have been audible wind, but no sound reached her ears at all. The silence zone, as Maria discovered through terrified experimentation, had definite boundaries. She could step outside the affected area and immediately hear normal sounds, then step back in and experience the absolute quiet that felt more oppressive than any noise ever could. The phenomenon lasted exactly 17 minutes before dissipating, leaving Maria with perfect hearing but profound psychological trauma. Dr. Rachel Kim, an acoustic specialist from the University of Colorado, was contacted when similar incidents began occurring throughout the region. Her initial assumption was that witnesses were experiencing sudden hearing loss, but medical examinations showed no damage to their auditory systems. More puzzling still, recording equipment placed within the silence zones showed that sounds were being produced normally. They simply weren't being perceived by human ears. The silence zones began appearing with increasing frequency, and Dr. Kim's research revealed disturbing patterns in their manifestation. The zones weren't random, but seemed to target areas where significant emotional or psychological events were taking place. Hospitals, schools, churches, and funeral homes showed the highest concentrations of final silence incidents. What made the phenomenon particularly unsettling was its effect on human behavior within the silence zones. Witnesses reported that the absence of sound created a profound sense of isolation and existential dread that went far beyond normal reactions to quiet environments. Many described feeling as though they had been severed from reality itself, cut off from the fundamental vibrations that connect all living things. Children seemed especially vulnerable to the psychological impact of final silence zones. Several young witnesses developed what psychiatrists termed acoustic anxiety disorder, becoming terrified of any situation where ambient sound levels dropped below normal conversation volume. Some children began refusing to sleep without multiple sources of continuous noise, afraid that silence might consume them during the night. Dr. Kim's research team discovered that the silence zones were expanding in both size and duration. Early incidents affected areas roughly 10 feet in diameter and lasted for only a few minutes. More recent occurrences created spheres of silence up to 100 feet across that persisted for hours at a time. Even more disturbing was the discovery that the zones weren't simply blocking sound perception, but were actually absorbing acoustic energy from their environment. Specialized equipment showed that sound waves entering a silence zone simply ceased to exist, their energy apparently consumed by whatever force was creating the phenomenon. The absorption wasn't limited to audible frequencies. Ultrasonic and infrasonic waves were also being consumed, suggesting that the zones were affecting the entire electromagnetic spectrum related to vibration and wave propagation. This discovery led to concerns about potential effects on cellular communication, brain function, and other biological processes that depend on wave-based systems. Research conducted by DreamVault Mysteries revealed that people who experience multiple exposures to final silence zones began to change in subtle but measurable ways. Their speech patterns became more deliberate and economical, as if they had developed a deep appreciation for the value of sound. Some reported enhanced hearing sensitivity outside the zones, becoming able to detect frequencies and nuances they had never noticed before. More troubling were reports that some individuals who had experienced final silence zones multiple times were beginning to create their own localized areas of quiet. Not through any conscious effort, but as if the phenomenon had infected them with the ability to absorb sound from their immediate environment. These individuals found themselves becoming increasingly isolated as their presence made others unconsciously uncomfortable. The psychological impact extended beyond direct witnesses. Communities affected by final silence zones began experiencing what researchers termed acoustic paranoia, where residents became hypervigilant about sound levels and would panic at the slightest reduction in ambient noise. Some towns instituted mandatory noise ordinances designed not to reduce sound, but to ensure minimum decibel levels were maintained at all times. The most recent development in final silence research has been the discovery that the zones are beginning to affect more than just sound. Witnesses report that within the most advanced silence zones, other sensory inputs also begin to fade. Colors become less vivid, textures feel muted, and even tastes and smells seem dampened, as if the zones are expanding their influence to consume all forms of sensory experience. Government agencies have classified much of the research into final silence zones, but leaked documents suggest that military applications are being explored. The ability to create areas where acoustic surveillance becomes impossible and where the psychological impact on enemy forces could be devastating has obvious strategic value. The most terrifying aspect of the final silence phenomenon is what it might represent. If these zones continue to expand in size, duration, and scope of effect, they could eventually create vast areas where human sensory experience becomes impossible. The prospect of a world consumed by expanding bubbles of nothingness, where sight, sound, and eventually all perception ceases to exist, represents perhaps the ultimate existential threat. Dr. Kim's final research notes, obtained by Dream Vault Mysteries before her disappearance in 2022, contained a chilling observation. We assume that silence is simply the absence of sound, but what if it's actually a presence? What if silence itself is alive, growing, consuming the vibrations that make existence possible? What if the final silence isn't just taking away our ability to hear, but preparing to take away our ability to exist? Conclusion: the pattern in the darkness. As we reach the end of our journey through these 10 impossibly creepy cases, one thing becomes terrifyingly clear. These aren't isolated mysteries scattered randomly across time and space. They're connected by threads that become visible only when you step back and look at the complete picture, threads that suggest something far more disturbing than individual unexplained phenomena. Each case represents a breakdown in the fundamental rules that govern our reality. Time flows backward, memories become tradable commodities, entire families vanish from existence, and silence itself becomes a living thing that consumes sound. What we're witnessing isn't just a collection of strange events, but evidence that the basic framework of reality is becoming unstable. The pattern that emerges is one of increasing frequency and intensity. These phenomena are becoming more common, more powerful, and more willing to reveal themselves to human observation. Whether this represents an evolution in unknown forces or a deterioration in the barriers that normally separate us from things beyond our understanding, one thing is certain: we're moving toward a tipping point where the impossible becomes inevitable. What makes these cases particularly unsettling is how they challenge not just our understanding of physics and biology, but our fundamental concepts of identity, consciousness, and existence itself. When memories can be traded like commodities, when time can flow backward, when entire populations can stop sleeping without consequence, the very notion of what it means to be human becomes questionable. The researchers, investigators, and brave individuals who have dedicated their lives to understanding these mysteries have paid a heavy price. Many have disappeared, others have had their memories altered, and some have become something other than entirely human. The pursuit of truth in these cases seems to exact a toll that goes beyond professional risk. changing those who venture too deep into territories where normal logic no longer applies. For those of us at Dream Vault Mysteries, these cases represent more than just fascinating puzzles to be solved. They're warnings about the fragility of the reality we take for granted, and reminders that the world is far stranger and more dangerous than we ever imagined. Each case we investigate opens doorways that perhaps should remain closed, revealing truths that human minds weren't designed to comprehend. But perhaps that's exactly why these mysteries need to be documented, studied, and shared. If we're approaching a fundamental shift in the nature of reality itself, then understanding these phenomena might be our only hope of surviving what's coming. The answers might be disturbing, but ignorance in the face of such forces could be far more dangerous. As you go about your daily life, remember that the ordinary world around you is far more fragile than it appears. The cases we've explored today are happening right now, in places that might be closer to you than you realize. The next time you experience something that doesn't quite make sense, something that feels impossible or wrong, don't dismiss it too quickly. You might be witnessing the early stages of a phenomenon that could eventually reshape everything we understand about existence itself. The 10 cases we've examined today represent just the tip of an iceberg that extends far deeper into the unknown than any of us are prepared to explore. But somewhere in that darkness, in the spaces between what we know and what we fear to discover, the truth is waiting, and whether we're ready or not, it's coming for all of us. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the impossible. If these mysteries have left you questioning everything you thought you knew about reality, then you're beginning to understand the true scope of what we're facing. Don't forget to subscribe to Dream Vault Mysteries for more investigations into the unexplained. And remember, sometimes the most important questions are the ones we're afraid to ask. Sweet dreams, if you can still manage to have them after what you've learned today.